Satellite. A satellite is any object that revolves in a curved path around a planet. There are two major types of categorization when it comes down to satellites. One is natural satellite, and the other is artificial satellite. A natural satellite is any celestial body in space that orbits around a larger body. Satellites that are made by people and launched into orbit using rockets are called artificial satellites. Launching an artificial satellite. The launching a satellite into orbit involves two-steps process. First, the satellite has to be taken to the desired altitude. Then, it has to be pushed off at the right velocity to begin and maintain its orbit. To launch a satellite in an orbit around the Earth, launch vehicle, such as a rocket or a space shuttle, is used. A launch vehicle travels straight up only for the first few seconds of its flight. A satellite launch vehicle is a multi-stage rocket. It also contains several smaller booster rockets. The boosters give the rocket its initial thrust during launch and carry the vehicle through the early part of the flight. As the fuel in the boosters is used up, the rocket falls away and the other boosters take over. Each time a booster is dropped, the vehicle gets lighter, so it can travel faster. When it finally reaches the proper altitude and speed, it releases the satellite into the orbit. How a satellite works. Satellite communication consists of three main components: uplink, satellite transponder, downlink. An uplink earth station or other ground equipment transmits the desired signal to the satellite. This satellite transponder amplifies the incoming signal and changes the frequency. This satellite transponder transmits the signal back to downlink earth station, and the ground equipment receives the signal. Satellite communication uses ground stations to send and receive microwave signals between artificial satellites, which are in orbit around the Earth. Types of satellite orbits. By inclination, there are three kinds of satellite orbits: equatorial orbit, inclined orbit, and polar orbit. Equatorial orbit. An equatorial orbit is when the satellite rotates in an orbit directly above the equator, usually in a circular path. It has an inclination of 0 degrees. Inclined orbit. Inclined orbits are virtually all orbits except those that travel directly above the equator or directly above the north and south poles. The angle of inclination vary between 0 to 180 degrees. Polar orbit. A polar orbit is when the satellite rotates in a path that takes it over the north and south poles in an orbital pattern that is perpendicular to the equatorial plane. Polar orbiting satellites follow a low-altitude path close to Earth's surface, passing over and very close to both the north and south poles. The angle of inclination of a satellite in a polar orbit is nearly 90 degrees. On the basis of the altitude from Earth, the types of orbits are classified into low Earth orbit, medium Earth orbit, and geostationary Earth orbit. Low Earth orbit. Low Earth orbit satellites operate at a distance of about 160 to 2,000 kilometers above the Earth's surface. It takes approximately 90 to 120 minutes to circle the Earth. Medium Earth orbit. Medium Earth orbit is the region of space around the Earth above low Earth orbit and below geostationary orbit. The orbital periods of medium Earth orbit satellites range from about 2 to 6 hours. This satellite operates at altitudes between 2,000 kilometers and 35,786 kilometers above the Earth's surface. Geostationary Earth orbit. A geostationary satellite is an Earth-orbiting satellite. It placed at an altitude of approximately 35,786 kilometers directly over the equator, that revolves in the same direction the Earth rotates, that means west to east. This satellite takes 24 hours to orbit the Earth. Orbits are also classified into two types on the basis of the shape: circular orbit and elliptical orbit. Circular orbit. Circular orbit is the orbit with a fixed distance around the barycenter, that is, in the shape of a circle. This orbit has an eccentricity of 0. There are several types of circular orbits, and they include geostationary orbit, polar orbit, and equatorial orbit. Elliptical orbit. An elliptical orbit is the revolving of one object around another in an oval-shaped path called an ellipse. The eccentricity of an elliptical orbit is greater than 0 but less than 1. Sometimes these satellites are closer, and at other times they are farther away from Earth. The closest point a satellite comes to Earth is called its perigee. The farthest point is the apogee. The most common example of elliptical orbit is highly elliptical orbit. Types of artificial satellites. Navigation satellite. A satellite navigation system used to determine the ground position of an object. It determines the geographic location of ships, aircrafts, or any other object. It is also vital to military forces. It is often used for gathering intelligence used for military purposes or as a military weapon. The major satellite navigation systems. The navigation satellite system with global coverage is called Global Navigation Satellite System or GNSS. The United States was the first country to introduce satellite technology with the Global Positioning System or GPS. Another ambitious global navigation satellite system aside from GPS in development is the Galileo system in Europe. Russia also has its own satellite system, called the Russian Global Navigation Satellite System or GLONASS. In China, there is the Beidou Navigation Satellite System, which will consist of more than 30 satellites. There is the Indian Regional Navigation Satellite System or IRNSS in India. Lastly, the Quasi-Zenith Satellite System or QZSS is Japan's satellite system, which is similar to a GPS satellites with some slight variations. Weather satellite. Weather satellites are primarily used to monitor the weather and climate of the Earth, to predict daily weather conditions, such as temperature and rainfall, to monitor how weather conditions, like storms, hurricanes, cyclone, tropical storms, develop and change over time. Communications satellite. The communications satellite is a satellite that transmits the signals such as telephone, television, radio, internet signals over long distances. If you do like my channel, please subscribe, comment, share the videos to your friends and like them.